everybody. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the presentation, Hans-Jürg. And it's an interesting annual international conference, not only about extractivism, but also about transition. That is a big issue now. So my topic is from commodities consensus to decarbonization consensus. And so that is the title. I'm going to break it down into 4 sections. Global context, second, eco-social transition and some definition about decarbonization consensus. Third, lithium as a leading case. We talk again about lithium. And finally, some comparison between decarbonization consensus and commodities consensus. So the global context, polycrisis. We live in times of polycrisis. It is often said. We have gone from the extraordinary crisis marked by lockdown during COVID-19 to the civilizatory polycrisis marked by a multiplicity of crises. Unpredictability and instability have become the norm. The sequence of profound crises, social, political, health, geopolitical, economic, and ecological, can no longer be dealt like before in isolation, as they juxtapose and reinforce each other, generating situations of greater uncertainty and danger. An example of the polycrisis is the acceleration of the climate crisis and the ecological collapse. However, collapse does not imply the collapse of a planet overnight. It implies that changes are taking place in a negative sense, in a society that is heading toward chaos, that is heading towards social decomposition and the breakdown of ecosystems. And in particular, it implies the multiplication of localized collapses, which are becoming more and more frequent as a result of the climate crisis and the extreme events. Floods in Libya, this image, floods in Libya in 2023, caused by the bursting of 2 dams, have killed more than 11,000 people. Also in 2023, a tornado destroyed Acapulco in Mexico. There were great fires in Hawaii. And recently, Rio Grande do Sul. The great flood in Rio Grande do Sul, probably the most far-reaching localized collapse ever experienced. More than 200 people dead, more than 500,000 people displaced, extensive damage infrastructure, among others. But collapse is not the end of the world, but probably is the end of the world as we know it, as Pablo Servigni and Raphael Stevens says in France. However, the collapse is not only ecological, it's also political. We are witnessing the suicide of our democracies in the face of the expansion of the far right and the erosion of democratic values and belief. This goes hand in hand with the expansion of the war conflicts and the normalization of militarism, first through Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which generated an energy crisis here, especially in Germany and in Europe, and now with war in Gaza and the denial by many countries, government, political leaders of the genocide being perpetrated by Israel in Gaza. In this context, the war contributed to the exacerbation of both traditional extractivism and the new extractivisms associated with the energy transition in the countries of the North. Therefore, far from being reduced, inequalities have been exacerbated in the aftermath of the pandemic. 1% of the world population controls 38% of global wealth, while the poorest 50% of the world's populations owns only 2% of the total. This can also be translated regarding greenhouse gas emissions. the richest 1% of the world population emits more greenhouse gases than the poorest 50%. In sum, the reality of collapse requires major changes. It implies that if you are speaking of collapse, you must also speaking of transition. The collapse is therefore systemic in the context of concentrating, exclusionary, and ecocidal capitalism. All of this requires an effort of political imagination that opens up horizons different from those of reactionary utopia, which presupposes many structural transformations, many transitions at the same time, a change in the socio-ecological regime in order to move towards a just transition. We need to go to the eco-social transition and especially the energy transition, but not just any transition. This is why we need to clarify again and again that there are many transitions, not just one path to transitions. There is not one conception of energy transition, but many. There are proposals for transition with clearly different objectives. Political economic views from neoliberalism, social democracy to anti-capitalism, and from ecological perspective, popular environmentalism, the cult of wildlife, to eco-efficiency, eco-corporate, and even ecofascism. In order to make this diagnosis more complex, I would like to present a geopolitical analysis that emphasizes what type of decarbonization is being proposed by the countries of the North and their consequences of the global South, especially Latin America, and what is the position of critical sectors from the global South. Before this, let me start by sharing my position. In Argentina, with a colleague, Enrique Viale, we wrote in 2020 a book entitled The Ecological Collapse Had Already Arrived, a guide out of maldevelopment. Our bet was never on collapse, but on the contrary, on resilience, on healing, on care, which in political terms means a commitment to a just eco-social transition. Also, since 2020, with other colleagues and activists, we are promoting the eco-social and intercultural pact from the South. This Latin American collective was formed during the pandemic and was motivated by the urgency of responding to the different crises that the contemporary world is going through, but also because we need to offer alternatives in Latin American terms to the proposal for socio-ecological transition and green pacts that have emerged in recent years. In recent years, the socio-ecological transition has moved from being an issue restricted to activist groups and scientists to a central focus of contemporary political and economic agendas. A number of Green New Deal proposals have proliferated, and beyond their diversity, they have become a political discursive confluence framework in the global North for reducing carbon emissions and promoting equitable and supposedly sustainable economic growth. However, there are many issues. First of all, in the face of the urgency of decarbonization, there is a tendency to reduce the socio-ecological transition to the energy transition. From my perspective, the eco-social transition must be understood in terms of comprehensive and profound social change, which encompasses all spheres of social life, production, food, and urban levels, as a change of socio-ecological regime. The socio-ecological transition is a larger horizon that should make us put more radical questions about what kind of society we want to live in. Our starting point is the recognition that we live on a damaged planet, as I said before, a planet that is collapsing, not only environmentally, but also systemically. The second issue concerns the reduction of the problem of energy transition to the change of matrix, of sources, from oil fuels to clean energy, without a reform of the energy systems. In this way, all the problems linked to the fossil fuel energy matrix, economic concentration, social inequality, and energy poverty are preserved and even exacerbated. Moreover, the emphasis is not placed on changing the social metabolism, but on enhancing the imperial way of life, as Uli Brandt argued. Third, there is another problem: how the energy transition is being carried out and who will pay the cost in social and geopolitical terms. The clean energy transition of the North has put even more pressure on the global South to extract cobalt and lithium for the production of high-tech battery, balsa wood for wind turbines, land for large solar arrays, and new infrastructure for hydrogen megaprojects. As a starting point, there is a first great universe associated to the corporate energy transition. In fact, there are actors who, confronted with the climate situation, see in the energy transition a potential for wealth accumulation and geopolitical hegemony position. Beyond the business sphere, the corporate energy transition may have diverse supporters, such as multinational companies, state, and their multiple scales, institutions, and organizations. Many defend this concept as the fastest way to respond to the urgency of the crisis based on the idea of technological efficiency. The objective is to decarbonize and to emit fewer greenhouse gases and generate some geopolitical support in the face of growing public concern about climate change. This is articulated with the growing process of accumulation of wealth and power through the new extraction areas which aims to maintain to existing relations of inequality. Within this framework, the issue of ownership and control of access to energy sources, materials, and necessary technologies plays a central role. The concentration of the energy system is an inherent characteristic of it. Large companies, not only private, but in many cases public, hold the hegemonic power. So, along with Breno Bringe, Spanish-Brazilian colleague, we are thinking of this new moment under the Decarbonization Consensus, and we consider that green colonialism is at the core of the new capitalist consensus. It is essential to clarify this new intensification of extractivism in the name of the North green energy transition. The vision of a corporate energy transition is visible in the continuity of a model with the same logic of concentration of the fossil fuel regime, which perpetuates the vertical scheme of territorial intervention typical of the predatory extractivism already known. The Global South, once again, becomes a storehouse of supposedly inexhaustible resources, from which strategic minerals are extracted for the energy transition of the Global North, as well as a destination for the waste and pollution generated by this new industrial revolution. To us, the Decarbonization Consensus is a new global agreement under construction, work in progress, I don't know, but under construction, that advocates a shift from a fossil fuel-based energy system to a carbon-free or low-carbon one based on renewable energies. Its leitmotif is the fight against global warming and the climate crisis, stimulated an energy transition promoted by the electrification of consumption and digitalization. Thus, the corporate energy transition is based on the idea of sustainable development and the green economy. Although these ideas on decarbonization have become more complex and opaque with the expansion of the green bond market, the Decarbonization Consensus restricts the horizon of the fight against climate change to what Brazilian researcher Camila Moreno defines as the carbon metric, as limited way of quantifying carbon only based on CO2 molecules, which offers a kind of currency for international exchange, generating the illusion that something is being done against environmental degradation. In this way, the underlying problem is covered up. Not only do we continue to pollute, but pollution itself has become a new arena for business. For example, emission offset trading. All of this serves to maintain or legitimize the dynamic of economic growth. Yes. Decarbonization is not seen as a part of a broader process of changing to the metabolic profile of society, its patterns of production, consumption, circulation of goods, and waste generation. In fact, the natural and ecological limits of the planet continue to be ignored. Decarbonization in this context is not a means, but an end in itself. That is some books that published especially in the South, but not only in the South, but not just in the South, some books about this topic, about green colonialism, and the analysis of some cases. For example, in a green colonialism in Arab region, colonialismo energético by Josefa Contreras and Alberto Matarán. They analyze several cases, and not only in the South, in the global South, but in the global North too. And the geopolitics of green colonialism is associated with the eco-social pact from the South, but not just. And the transition, the energy transition in Argentina is a book published, I published with Pablo Bertinat in 2022. So, lithium as a leading case. I think that in geopolitical terms, the lithium issue is a leading case to analyze this type of corporate transition. Lithium is considered the master key for the energy transition because as a final product, ion lithium batteries are energy storage and are used for the development of electric cars. 58% of the global lithium resources and 53% of the reserves are concentrated in Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile, the Atacama region, called the lithium triangle, in the high and Andean salt flats. In addition, reserves have been discovered in Peru and in Mexico. They are even considering exploring for lithium in the Argentinian Patagonia. We know this concentration has unleashed enormous pressure from international capitals and central countries on these territories. Globally, we are witnessing a battle for control of the so-called critical minerals for the energy and digital transition, including lithium, as well as for control of knowledge in the global value chain. The unfolding energy transition reinforces a strong degree of economic concentration, as is already the case with fossil fuels. There is an intense concentration of power among large companies from the beginning to the end of the global chains. At the end of the global value chain are all the automaker giants, Toyota, BMW, Volkswagen, Audi, Nissan, General Motors, electrical firms like Vestas and Tesla, the Chinese BED. More than 50% of the battery for the automotive industry are concentrated in companies in China. In addition, extraction control is also dominated by a few companies, the American Albemarle, the Chilean SQM, the North American Livent Corporation, Oro Cobre of Australia, and Ganfeng of China. A commodity, lithium carbonate, without added value is exported from Argentina or Chile. The main problem with lithium is that it is fundamentally water mining. Its extraction in brine requires the consumption of unsustainable amounts of water in an arid region. This puts at risk the fragile ecosystem of the desert, its wildlife, and the livelihoods of the people who live there, especially indigenous communities. The fact is that in Argentina, as well as in the Atacama region of Chile, due to water consumption, lithium extraction threatens to break the fragile water balance. It tends to dry up aquifers and water reserves in areas that are already characterized by aridity and hydric stress, especially in Chile. It also competes for water with the agricultural and grazing activities of the local indigenous communities that have inhabited the territory for thousands of years, while threatening biodiversity. The intervention in the salt flats is very aggressive, as you can see in this slide, okay, where pipes, pump feeding, and pools intersect. That is, okay. In many cases, lithium extraction has advanced without social license, that is, without the agreement or consultation of the communities. In Las Salinas Grandes, in Jujuy, Argentina, more than 40 communities do not want the lithium extraction in their territories. They defend a holistic and ancestral perspective, the relational narrative linked to the ideas such as good living, territory, autonomy, plurinationality, water and sustainability of life. The salt flats are considered by indigenous people as a living being, as a giver of life. So they don't want to be a son of sacrifice. In addition, this case shows that the post-fossil transition cannot be used as an excuse for consolidating or continuing to maintain consumption models that are openly unsustainable. It is not enough to replace fossil fuel-based cars with electric cars. We should reduce consumption and move toward public and shared mobility models so that they become really sustainable. The fact that lithium batteries, as well as wind and solar projects, also requires many minerals, such as copper, zinc, among others, warns us of the need to carry out a radical reform of the transportation system and, in general, of the consumption model. Because there is not planet that can endure or enough lithium if the consumption models are not changed facing electromobility. Even the World Bank report notes that the production of minerals such as graphite, lithium, and cobalt could result in an increase of nearly 500% by 2050 to meet the growing demand for clean energy technologies. It is estimated that more than 3 billion tons of minerals and metals will be required for the implementation of wind, solar, and geothermal energy, as well as energy storage, to achieve a temperature reduction below 2 degrees in the future. So, we are not saying that the process of decarbonization is not taken into account in the global south. No? But we say that this decarbonization proposal is expressed in green colonialism, which reproduces the domination over nature and population. Finally, we do think that decarbonization must be the weight of commodification and colonialism. During 2022 and 2023, We worked with other intellectuals and activists from the Global South, from not only from Latin America, but from Asia and Africa. We discussed current green transition projects in our countries, those affecting indigenous territories where there is lithium, balsa wood in Ecuador, green hydrogen projects in North Africa. In this People's Manifesto of the South for an eco-social energy transition, we argue that the problems of the Global South are different from those of the Global North and emerging powers such as China. We even visited the European Parliament in 2023. I spoke 30 minutes in the European Parliament, just at the time when they were discussing the Critical Raw Materials Act. And we found it very interesting, especially because it gave us the possibility to see what are the terms in which the energy transition is publicly discussed. However, the proposed European Union strategy will not lead to a sustainable supply of critical minerals for Europe, as it will exacerbate the risk to human rights and the environment, undermine economic dynamics in partner countries, and continue to reinforce unsustainable consumption in rich countries. The familiar extractive paradigm remains in place, but in addition, hand in hand with this green colonialism, the ecological and climate debt of northern countries toward the south is increasing. The constant search for the expansion of capitalist frontier involves the promotion of mega projects aimed to control, extract, and export natural resources. To this end, there is a clear commitment to guaranteeing the legal security of capital with regulatory and legal basis that yield greater corporate profit. For example, the new bilateral trade agreements being negotiated by the European Union seek to incorporate some chapters about energy and raw materials in order to guarantee access to critical minerals for the transition. In this context, the European Union approved a proposal for critical raw materials regulation to ensure a secure and sustainable supply of critical raw materials for them. What is new about this current moment? In 2011, I wrote an article on the commodities consensus to explain the new Latin American moment from 2000 onwards, characterized by the boom in commodity prices and the reprimarization of Latin American economies oriented towards large-scale exports. Beyond the differences, because there were differences, I also said that the commodities consensus went beyond the ideological characteristic of each government, whether they are conservative, neoliberal, or progressive, in the times of the pink tide. In this slide, I summarize, no, it's not that, sorry. In this slide, I summarize what I understand by a commodities consensus. Along this direction, with Breno Bringel, we consider that the decarbonization consensus presents strong continuities with the commodities consensus. Inevitability, corporate capture, and extractivism. So the first is the discourse of inevitability, which states that there is no alternative. The commodities consensus, as from 2000, for instance, was built on the idea that there was an agreement on the irrevocable nature of the extractivist dynamic resulting from the growing global demand for raw materials. These close off the possibilities of other alternatives. Similarly, the decarbonization consensus seeks today to forge the idea that, given the climate urgency, there is no other possible transition than the corporate transition. Second, all these consensus imply a large concentration of power in the hands of non-democratic actors, large corporations, financial actors, and international organizations, thereby undermining any possibility of democratic governance, even more so in a context of green transition. Third, the decarbonization consensus is marked by ecological imperialism. It mobilizes not only practices, but also a neo-colonial ecological imaginary. For example, governments and companies often use the idea of empty space, typical of imperial geopolitics. In the past, this notion of living space, Lebensraum, generated ecocide and indigenous ethnocide, and it served to promote policies of development and colonization of territories. However, today it is used to justify territorial expansionism for green energy investment. In many cases, what is at stake is also a kind of internal green colonialism, which enables the advance of green extractivism based on colonial alliances and relations between domestic and global elites. Four, the temporality and the way of the decarbonization consensus is implemented, and the way the decarbonization consensus is implemented trigger contradiction even among its promoters. The worsening of schizophrenic behaviors and policies, or the double bind, to use Gregory Bateson's terms, seems to be a sign of the civilizational polycrisis. There are those who, while recognizing its importance, seek to delay decarbonization by extracting every last drop of oil, like many fossil fuel companies and government lobbyists do. One example is the expansion of the extreme energies, like unconventional hydrocarbons throughout fracking and offshore drilling. Another example of this is a record for fossil fuel subsidies, consumption subsidies that benefit companies. In 2022, they were twice as high as in 2021. That meant record profits for fossil corporations like BP, ExxonMobil, Chevron, Equinor, and the Arabian companies too. And the coexistence between the discourse of energy security and that of energy transition had several results. The European Union chose to return to coal in mid-2022 here in Germany, using the energy crisis accelerated by the war in Ukraine as an excuse. They again supported nuclear power plants and continue to consider fossil gas as a transition fuel. Beyond these lines of continuity, there are also novelties regarding commodities consensus. An essential feature of the decarbonization consensus is the complexity of neo-colonial relations in a multipolar world marked by inter-imperial competition. It is not only the European Union lacking critical minerals which is seeking direct access to them. Despite having them, China is very well positioned in the global south, where for almost two decades, it has been making aggressive investment in strategic extractive sectors. One of the peculiarities of these new Latin American and African countries' dependency on China is that investments are long-term and in different sectors, agribusiness, mining, oil, or infrastructure linked to extractive activities. Regarding technology transfer, particularly concerning the green transition, China tends to use cutting-edge technology, which sometimes includes Chinese labor too. The inter-imperial tension is completed with the United States, although this issue seemed to be absent from the State Department statement. On several occasions, the head of the Southern Command, General Laura Richardson, had made clear the strategic interest the United States has in South America in terms of water, oil, lithium, and other minerals. Finally, let us add that Russia is a primary export power, is an important actor in a multipolar world, but is far from having the reach of the energy transition. Another important point is the range of products and mineral has broadened. In the first case, for the commodities consensus, they are fundamentally food products, hydrocarbons, and minerals such as copper, gold, silver, tin, bauxite, and zinc. While in the second, in addition, in the decarbonization consensus, the focus of interest is on the so-called critical minerals needed for the energy transition, such as lithium, cobalt, graphite, and indium, among others, as well as rare earth. In both cases, the extraction and export of raw materials have consequences in terms of ecological destruction and generation of dependency. The dominant energy transition is a mineral transition. And open pit mining is one of the most questioned extractive activities in the world, and particularly in Latin America in the last 20 years. Don't forget that Latin America is the region in the world where most environmental defenders are killed, especially associated with the resistance against mega mining and agribusiness. Resistance to mega mining is emblematic in Latin America. Mega mining is an extreme form of extractivism in terms of the normative framework of dispossession, environmental impacts, and the violation of civil and political rights. If for that the social movement say more mining, less democracy. Resistance against mega mining are at the heart of the elaboration of a new eco-territorial language associated with the defense of land and territory. So this kind of decarbonization of the wealthy countries depends in a new phase of environmental dispossession, criminalization, and violence of the global south. It seems, as said my colleague Edgardo Lander from Venezuela, that the place of Latin America in the international division of labor is, on the one hand, drug trafficking, in the other hand, extractivism. In other words, the expansion of criminal structures and extractivism of all kinds involve more militarization of the territories. Finally, another significant distinguished element between both is the role of the state. We know that the commodities consensus was a moderately regulatory state, but in close alliance with transnational capital. In turn, the decarbonization consensus seems to inaugurate the emergence of a new type of planning neo-estatism, in some cases closer to eco-corporate state that combines green transition with the promotion of public-private funds and the financialization of nature. Okay. However, we know that the geopolitical analysis provides a general interpretive framework. This must be complemented and integrated with an analysis at the national level, no? Based on the reception of this model in each country. In certain scenarios, such as in Colombia, where socio-environmental progressivism exists, we can see an energy transition in dispute, where the role of the state and social organization is fundamental. By this, I can see, or I mean that nothing is linear, okay? Decarbonization consensus is in progress, under construction, and the corporate energy transition is likely to encounter numerous obstacles due to the role of social movements and maybe public policies and the articulation to the state. To sum up, final thoughts, okay. I would like to conclude by listing 3 fundamental points for thinking on a just eco-social transition in geopolitical terms. First of all, faced with the great inequality that exists between countries and economies in the world, there is no other option than to think of large redistribution processes where the central economies will obviously have to consume less material and energy, and important sectors of the population in the peripheral economies will have to consume more energy. But we must all accept that it will be necessary to consume differently. Any hypothesis of a just eco-social transition can be considered if we don't change the metabolic profile. This implies incorporating the imperative or mandate of the growth on the part of the global north and the wealthiest sectors. The global north must urgently begin to degrowth in several areas in terms of consumption, reduction of the sphere of commodification, dematerialization of production, transport, and the distribution of working hours. Degrowth is a demand for global justice in the context of an already damaged planet. In addition, as several references of degrowth have been warning, the progressive reduction of social metabolism would result in less pressure on natural resources and the territories on the south. This opening up a conceptual space for another kind of relationship between society and economy. In the global south, we talk about post-extractivism. On the other hand, the South should not claim its right to development because this so-called development is currently pushing us toward collapse. It is necessary to produce and consume differently. Secondly, any scenario for a just and integral eco-social transition can be established without linking ecological and climate debt. Climate debt is one line in the balance sheet of a broader ecological debt. Not only the central countries have created the conditions for the current climate crisis, but they have also systemically disregarded their international responsibility for the ecological debt with the poorest and most peripheral countries. The Latin American region, for example, is responsible for only 8% of global CO2 emissions, while Africa accounts for barely 3%. Moreover, the ones that are suffering the most from the multiple impacts of climate change today are the poorest and peripheral countries. Ecological debt is also closely linked to foreign debt. The pressure to extract natural resources that the capitalist centers exert on the periphery is exacerbated in the context of foreign debt. Foreign debt blocks, in that case, the possibility of thinking about any alternative of change. We know that in Argentina, before this government. To complete the imperial model of ecological debt, it turns out that it is the central countries who decide on loans and aid and their implementation modalities through international organizations to give to the countries of the South, which are affected by localized collapses in order to rebuild their always vulnerable societies and economies. As a result, the foreign debt is increased. In this framework, degrowth and post-extractivism are two complementary, multidimensional perspectives that allow internationalist and North-South bridges to be built around an integral eco-social transition. They both critique the ecological limits of the planet and emphasizes the unsustainability of imperial consumption models and the deepening of social inequalities. In contrast to what the Decarbonization Consensus proposes, energy must be thought of the right of a right, and energy democracy, energy sovereignty as a horizon for sustaining the fabric of life. Eco-social justice must aim to eliminate energy poverty and dismantle power relations. On the horizon of a just energy transition, fossil fuels must be left in the ground, and the processes of hydrocarbon exploitation must be de-escalated, as suggested by the colleagues of the organization Sensata Agua Viva in Colombia and in Yasuní, Ecuador, which implies a rupture of meaning in order to resignify nature. Last but not least, I finish. The ecological and climate crisis is introducing new risks, mostly with the irreversible damage, which affect people unevenly. We should go beyond the logic of a state that repairs damage to build a state capable of preventing it. An eco-social state should seek a social protection mechanism that is as universal as possible. This would entail wide-ranging reforms aimed at the heart of existing inequalities and ecological risk, confronting the double injustice, social and environmental, of this new reality, from basic income and tax reform, work sharing, the creation of new trades and green jobs, to public policy for adapting to environmental risk and a national care system, among others. Profound and complex reforms aiming at a horizon of a just and popular eco-social transition. Because on the contrary to what the neoliberal perspective and the far-right parties support, we need more state and not less, but certainly a different state, an eco-social state with a democratic and egalitarian vocation that incorporates global and local environmental challenges and develops strategies for a just transition. Thank you for your attention.